Good afternoon. I have a new plane, a Cobi P Thunderbolt in 1/32nd scale. And yes, it is big and heavy as it looks. Um, Dimensionally, I think it's one of their best models. I mean, as far as looks and appearances, beautiful plane. Excuse me while I show off the instruction manual with other planes on it. Most importantly, the part list. So if you do get one of these, make sure you study this so that you don't mix parts up. I had no issues with that with this plane. It was actually pretty easy to build for how big it is, and problem was it was kind of heavy to just kind of pick up and stuff. It does do well though on the display stand, which I'll show later. Landing gears are newer ones where they have these block things, which you just put your finger on when you retract the landing gear and they don't pop off. Very clean design. Actually, very nice plane. The hardest part was getting the pilot in and having the oxygen line, which connects to the mast, kind of fit in there so that you could get him in and close up the canopy, which I did. So I will not be taking him out. He will sit in his seat. Overall, box actually looked very good. It's in pretty good shape. Excuse the other noises in the background. And it has a pretty good amount of information. I'm going to give a little bit more info about this plane because I did some studying up on it after I built it. They list the top speed as 433 miles an hour, usually with some 426 to 505 miles per hour, depending upon the plane, how much it weighed, and what they were using it for. This particular one, the maximum ceiling of 42,000 feet is about, seems what it is. And actually, this is the most expensive American fighter plane made during World War II, the P-47. Why? Looks like a big, kind of like a, I don't know, kind of like a big beer can kind of a thing or something. It's actually a very highly advanced and technologically engaging fighter plane. It has a turbo supercharger, which goes into the lower section here, feeds into an inlet, which goes into the actual supercharger, producing power. This engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800, also known as a twin-row Wasp, was basically a development of the single-row Wasp 9-cylinder radio. It's basically two 9 cylinders put into an 18-cylinder to give it 2,000 horsepower, which was incredible in 1942, 41, in comparison to what was in Europe. But this is a much larger plane, dimensionally, but it's very clean aerodynamically. It's big, but everything's there for a reason. This turbo supercharger can let this thing fly 450 miles an hour, basically at 42,000 feet. Very fast plane, by one of the fastest high altitude interceptors. And they have a lighter bubble top version. This is called a Razorback because the way the back comes like a razor, that could go even quicker and was even lighter. Drawbacks of this plane, bad fuel consumption. Not a great range. I think the range on this, excuse me for a second, is 800 miles. Nothing. A P-51 or a Navy plane with fuel tanks could go further. They did have a drop tank that could be fitted there, and eventually they put them on the wings, which gave it enough range to be a bomber escort. But the thing that's incredible about this plane is just the things in it. It's got a turbo supercharger. It's a super advanced design. The die flaps on it are not the old cheesecloth like on a Dauntless. They're electronic. They're controlled electronically. The gauges are electronic. It has a heater in it. I mean, actually, the pilot wouldn't die at a high altitude. He still had to breathe oxygen because it wasn't a pressurized cabin, as far as I know. But, I mean, incredibly fast. Maneuverable? Because it is a big plane, but it accelerates like a bat out of hell. It's really, really fast, and it can pick up speed quick. I think this plane could do 3,200 feet per minute in climbing, which is pretty fast. Super strong. I could take a lot of punishment, and it was an air-cooled radial engine. It was not an inline engine like a Mustang had a Rolls-Royce Merlin. It is a V12 engine, which had a radiator and it had glycol coolant. There was no coolant. This used the force of the air to cool it, so it could take damage, unlike a inline engine fighter like a Spitfire or a Mustang could. Another thing about this plane, it's incredibly, I mean, its shape. It has elliptical wings like the Spitfire, and they managed to streamline it as best that they could for what they had in here. The reason it was so big, the turbocharger developed by General Electric, it was a huge. The ductwork on it is like HVAC ductwork in a multi-unit building. A man could literally crawl through the turbocharging plumbing work back to where it connected to the supercharger in here. That's how big, and that's why the plane itself is kind of big. This, I think, is one of the only planes that had that turbocharger. I think a P-38 might have had a version of it on both of its engines, but as far as an internal thing, that was key to this plane, was that turbo supercharger. Most of these planes had a two-stage supercharger, this one did. But to give it more power, they fit the turbo into it. So the turbo was feeding into the supercharger, the two-stage supercharger, which allowed this thing to fly. And it could accelerate really good. It also had 850 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. If you notice the way they're arranged, it's so that the fire power of the plane would spread out, and it could just decimate whatever it was going after. This plane actually did really good in Europe because of the engine system, and it wasn't a liquid-cooled engine. It did really good. And I think the Germans are kind of afraid of this plane because at high altitude it would just rip them to pieces. It's very fast, it could accelerate. And if you got hit by the machine guns out here, you were going to get turned into a piece of Swiss cheese, like in seconds. And the Air Force liked this plane and did well in Europe. Used in the Pacific too, where it had the ability to use its strengths, but like I said, it did not have the best range, so it had to have bases where it could land or carry drop tanks on the bottom. Any other little oddities of this plane? The engine in here could go up to 2,800 horsepower, depending on how they tuned it, what types of fuel. Once again, with turbocharging and supercharging, the amount of octane and the types of fuel will affect how well that works. Just like with a modern car, you put premium gas in a turbocharged car, it's going to fly. You run regular gas, it'll work, but you'll feel the lag, and it won't be doing its work as efficiently as it can with higher octane gas. The same goes with this plane. It needed special high octane gas in order for it to run efficiently. But I mean, it's a great plane. You wouldn't freeze in it. The cockpit was very large. The gun sight was superior. It had radar. It had a rear-facing radar, so it could tell that other planes were coming at it. This is a very infant type of radar. It's not like they would have later in the jets. And it also had I think, what was it called? It was a homing radar. So if they had some kind of radio beacon kind of a thing, they could home in with the radar on to where they had to go as far as kind of like a range finding kind of a thing. So it helped them kind of guide themselves without having to look to maps to navigate. They could follow the beacon. It also kind of lent into the gun sight, because eventually they had a radar gun sight, which wound up being in the F-86 Sabre during the Korean War. But I don't know whether or not, I didn't research that, if they experimented with it in this plane. It could have. But a lot of things that you would see later in jets were on this. You didn't see that in a P-51, you wouldn't see it in a P-38, but you did in this plane. They really did a great job engineering it. And it's a brute, it's a big plane. Excuse me for a moment. I want to try to compare it to a similar kind of a plane. If I can get this off. Bear with me. This is a Bell P-39Q Air Cobra. Same scale, 1/32nd. as the P-47. Look at the difference in size of the two planes. You're looking, it's got a liquid cooled engine, it's an Allison engine, GM, and it had a radiator, whereas the P-47, now air cooled. This plane, it was also used as ground attack. It would use these to sweep railroads in Europe. During the D-Day invasion, before and then after, these planes would come in low and shoot up locomotives carrying supplies to the front or food or whatever. And from what I've read, this is probably the best ground attack plane. It can absorb damage because it's air cooled, so you're not going to have things pop in the radiator and coolant leaking and the plane crashing. And literally the engine could be shot up. As long as it had some cylinders on it, the power would reduce. It would go slower, but they would get back to base, fix them up, and put them back out again. But this plane, I mean, just slaughtered German railway traffic. Blew up locomotives. They added rockets and bombs, but just with the 50 caliber machine guns, hitting the steam boiler on a locomotive, kaboom. And this plane did a lot. It also, at high altitude, was a great high altitude fighter. That was its biggest attributes, was its performance at low altitude and at high altitude. Its only drawback was maneuverability. It could not turn tight because it was a big plane. It could maneuver pretty good. If the pilot knew how to use its speed and strength, it could actually do some pretty good damage on its opponents. And like in a dive, I've read in some places, I don't know if it's true or not, this plane could go supersonic over 746 miles an hour in a dive. That's how strong this aircraft was. It was used into the 1950s, but allies of the United States used it when the jet age came. We didn't. We should have used it in Korea. It would have been a lot better for ground attacking than the P-51. But they thought the P-51, which is basically an air superiority fighter, could go and do the ground stuff. No, couldn't. This baby could. Other notes about it. A lot of pilots liked this plane and became aces in it. And as far as like bomber escort, its range made it kind of like not great for that. They did try it later when they added drop tanks to it, but it did not have the range of a P-51. But when you look at a plane totally American design with American equipment and not using foreign parts, like the Mustang was using a Rolls-Royce engine, you have this. Because the only inline we had was the V1710 Allison engine. It was basically a GM engine. It was okay engine. But, you know, it is what it is. This engine is specifically designed as an aircraft engine. And radial engines, I think, were better in the United States than a lot of the other countries because that was our staple. We like to use air-cooled engines. And this would be the epitome of it. The same engine was used in the Corsair and in the Hellcat, but not to the same extent, I think, as with this. The Corsair was a fast, nice plane, but the Corsair was like shoddily built. This thing was built superb. This was not a shoddily built plane. It was well engineered. It was very well produced. And in terms of price, I think this was the most expensive American fighter plane, P-47. But, I mean, it did a lot of good. It did great in Europe. And if you look at it, I'm trying to make this so it's easy for everybody to see. It is a wonderful plane. What did I pay for this? I think 50 something. It's one of their newer ones. It's got the better stand. It's got the dihedral where the wings look real, not just like a flat slab, which I think that's great that they're able to do that with these planes. It makes them even more real. And besides the pleasure of building one of these, they are pretty good looking. You can pull them up against any little die-cast corgis and stuff because you actually could like look at these things and kind of enjoy them and stuff. But that's about all I have to say. Let me see if I missed anything here because I did jot a few notes down. Oh yes, it also had an autopilot. So if you could use an autopilot button and just kind of hold the stick and cruise this baby along. Cruise control for the air. But as far as its war record, it was a great plane. There's not too many of these flying anymore. If you ever get a chance to go to an air show and see when I would go, they're kind of an awesome sight because it was like a very advanced aircraft when it came out in World War II. Super advanced and a super good fighter plane. And we're lucky that we had this plane to help us. So there it is. Let me get a better shot there. The Cobi P47. I would say this is a P47D, I think. Oh, last time I had a 118 scale that I had that was bigger than this, and then 172 scale, which I built years ago. And actually, I'm glad I did this because I was able to search it up. This is not just like a big, kind of a cumbersome looking plane, but a very advanced, from a technological standpoint, well thought out, well built fighter aircraft. Basically, this would be what you would see in the jets, a tactical fighter that could do any role, and that's what this plane did. This was a tactical fighter, and the P-51 was an air superiority type of a fighter. But that's all I have to say, so I'll cut it from here. I've got other stuff coming in models. I've got a MiG-29, I've got a T-72 tank, an FW-190. So next one that I build, I don't know, but I just wanted to share this one, and I hope you enjoyed it and enjoy building and learning. It's good to learn about the past, especially stuff like this, because then you can get, from a conceptualization standpoint, as far as tactics and stuff, what they do now and how they started to achieve things like that during the Second World War with these types of pieces of equipment, which can look odd to some people, but when it came out in 1942, 41, 43, it was state of the art and something to be awestruck by, I guess. Again, thank you, and I will come up with another video soon.